A cognitive bias refers to the systematic pattern of deviation from norm or rationality in judgment, whereby inferences about other people and situations may be drawn in an illogical fashion. Individuals create their own subjective social reality from their perception of the input. An individual's construction of social reality, not the objective input, may dictate their behavior in the social world. Thus, cognitive biases may sometimes lead to perceptual distortion, inaccurate judgment, illogical interpretation, or what is broadly called irrationality. Some cognitive biases are presumably adaptive. Cognitive biases may lead to more effective actions in a given context. Furthermore, cognitive biases enable faster decisions when timeliness is more valuable than accuracy, as illustrated in heuristics. Other cognitive biases are a byproduct of human processing limitations, resulting from a lack of appropriate mental mechanisms, bounded rationality, or simply from a limited capacity for information processing. A continually evolving list of cognitive biases has been identified over the last 6 decades of research on human judgment and decision-making in cognitive science, social psychology, and behavioral economics. Kahneman and Tversky, 1996, argue that cognitive biases have efficient practical implications for areas including clinical judgment, entrepreneurship, finance, and management. Overview. Bias arises from various processes that are sometimes difficult to distinguish. These include information processing shortcuts, heuristics, noisy information processing, distortions in the process of storage in and retrieval from memory, the brain's limited information processing capacity, emotional and moral motivations, social influence. The notion of cognitive biases was introduced by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in 1972 and grew out of their experience of people's innumeracy, or inability to reason intuitively with the greater orders of magnitude. Tversky, Kahneman, and colleagues demonstrated several replicable ways in which human judgments and decisions differ from rational choice theory. Tversky and Kahneman explained human differences in judgment and decision-making in terms of heuristics. Heuristics involve mental shortcuts which provide swift estimates about the possibility of uncertain occurrences. Baumeister and Bushman, 2010, p. 141. Heuristics are simple for the brain to compute but sometimes introduce severe and systematic errors. Tversky and Kahneman, 1974, p. 1125. For example, the representativeness heuristic is defined as the tendency to judge the frequency or likelihood of an occurrence by the extent of which the event resembles the typical case. Baumeister and Bushman, 2010, p. 141. The Linda problem illustrates the representativeness heuristic. Tversky and Kahneman, 1983. Participants were given a description of Linda that suggests Linda might well be a feminist, e.g., she is said to be concerned about discrimination and social justice issues. They were then asked whether they thought Linda was more likely to be a bank teller or a b bank teller and active in the feminist movement. A majority chose answer B. This error, mathematically, answer B, cannot be more likely than answer A, is an example of the conjunction fallacy. Tversky and Kahneman argued that respondents chose B because it seemed more representative or typical of persons who might fit the description of Linda. The representativeness heuristic may lead to errors such as activating stereotypes and inaccurate judgments of others. Hasselton et al., 2005, p. 726. Alternatively, critics of Kahneman and Tversky such as Gerd Gigerenzer argue that heuristics should not lead us to conceive of human thinking as riddled with irrational cognitive biases, but rather to conceive rationality as an adaptive tool that is not identical to the rules of formal logic or the probability calculus. Nevertheless, experiments such as the Linda problem grew into the heuristics and biases research program, which spread beyond academic psychology into other disciplines including medicine and political science. Types. Biases can be distinguished on a number of dimensions. For example, there are biases specific to groups, such as the risky shift, as well as biases at the individual level. Some biases affect decision-making, where the desirability of options has to be considered, e.g., sunk costs fallacy. Others, such as illusory correlation, affect judgment of how likely something is, or of whether one thing is the cause of another. A distinctive class of biases affect memory, such as consistency bias, remembering one's past attitudes and behavior as more similar to one's present attitudes. Some biases reflect a subject's motivation, for example, the desire for a positive self-image leading to egocentric bias and the avoidance of unpleasant cognitive dissonance. Other biases are due to the particular way the brain perceives, forms memories and makes judgments. This distinction is sometimes described as hot cognition versus cold cognition, as motivated reasoning can involve a state of arousal. Among the cold biases, some are due to ignoring relevant information, e.g., neglect of probability. Some involve a decision or judgment being affected by irrelevant information, for example the framing effect, where the same problem receives different responses depending on how it is described, or the distinction bias, where choices presented together have different outcomes than those presented separately. Others give excessive weight to an unimportant but salient feature of the problem, e.g., anchoring. The fact that some biases reflect motivation, and in particular the motivation to have positive attitudes to oneself, accounts for the fact that many biases are selfing or self-directed, e.g., illusion of asymmetric insight, selfing bias. There are also biases in how subjects evaluate in-groups or out-groups, evaluating in-groups as more diverse and better in many respects, even when those groups are arbitrarily defined, in-group bias, out-group homogeneity bias. Some cognitive biases belong to the subgroup of attentional biases, which refer to the paying of increased attention to certain stimuli. It has been shown, for example, that people addicted to alcohol and other drugs pay more attention to drug-related stimuli. Common psychological tests to measure those biases are the Stroop task and the dot probe task. List. A 2012 Psychological Bulletin article suggests that at least 8 seemingly unrelated biases can be produced by the same information theoretic generative mechanism. It is shown that noisy deviations in the memory-based information processes that convert objective evidence, observations, into subjective estimates, decisions, can produce regressive conservatism, the belief revision, Bayesian conservatism, illusory correlations, illusory superiority, better than average effect, and worse than average effect, subadditivity effect, exaggerated expectation, overconfidence, and the hard-easy effect. Practical significance. Many social institutions rely on individuals to make rational judgments. The securities regulation regime largely assumes that all investors act as perfectly rational persons. In truth, actual investors face cognitive limitations from biases, heuristics, and framing effects. A fair jury trial, for example, requires that the jury ignore irrelevant features of the case, weigh the relevant features appropriately, consider different possibilities open-mindedly, and resist fallacies such as appeal to emotion. The various biases demonstrated in these psychological experiments suggest that people will frequently fail to do all these things. However, they fail to do so in systematic, directional ways that are predictable. Cognitive biases are also related to the persistence of superstition, to large social issues such as prejudice, and they also work as a hindrance in the acceptance of scientific non-intuitive knowledge by the public. However, in some academic disciplines, the study of bias is very popular. For instance, bias is a widespread phenomenon and well studied, because most decisions that concern the minds and hearts of entrepreneurs are computationally intractable. Reducing. Similar to Geiger-Enzer, 1996, Hasselton et al., 2005, state the content and direction of cognitive biases are not arbitrary, p. 730. Moreover, cognitive biases can be controlled. Debiasing is a technique which aims to decrease biases by encouraging individuals to use controlled processing compared to automatic processing, Baumeister and Bushman, 2010, p. 155. In relation to reducing the fee, monetary incentives, and informing participants they will be held accountable for their attributions have been linked to the increase of accurate attributions. Training has also shown to reduce cognitive bias. Morwedge and colleagues, 2015, found that research participants exposed to one-shot training interventions, such as educational videos and debiasing games that taught mitigating strategies, exhibited significant reductions in their commission of 6 cognitive biases immediately and up to 3 months later. Cognitive bias modification refers to the process of modifying cognitive biases in healthy people and also refers to a growing area of psychological, non-pharmaceutical, therapies for anxiety, depression, and addiction called cognitive bias modification therapy, CBMT. CBMT is subgroup of therapies within a growing area of psychological therapies based on modifying cognitive processes with or without accompanying medication and talk therapy, sometimes referred to as applied cognitive processing therapies, ACCEPT. Although cognitive bias modification can refer to modifying cognitive processes in healthy individuals, CBMT is a growing area of evidence-based psychological therapy, in which cognitive processes are modified to relieve suffering from serious depression, anxiety, and addiction. CBMT techniques are technology-assisted therapies that are delivered via a computer with or without clinician support. CBM combines evidence and theory from the cognitive model of anxiety, cognitive neuroscience, and attentional models. Criticisms. There are criticisms against theories of cognitive biases based on the fact that both sides in a debate often claim each other's thoughts to be in human nature and the result of cognitive bias, while claiming their own viewpoint as being the correct way to overcome cognitive bias. This is not due simply to debate misconduct but is a more fundamental problem that stems from psychology's making up of multiple opposed cognitive bias theories that can be non-falsifiably used to explain away any viewpoint.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.